In a glass-walled boardroom overlooking Tribeca, a soft-spoken systems architect was about to be quietly erased. What started as a routine status update on system performance took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a termination letter signed by the man whose career she had once saved. Rhea Saito wasn't your typical software engineer. For 6 years, she had spent her life building one of the most advanced predictive financial infrastructures in New York, known for writing code so elegant it prevented a $900 million collapse before dawn. When she watched the company she architected attempt to remove her name from its legacy, she had no idea she was walking into a war, not with fists, but with firewalls. Rhea stayed silent, then activated a hidden protocol that would lead to a global licensing freeze and the collapse of her former employer's control. What began as a quiet firing would become an international reckoning. The financial world would never be the same after Rhea Saito rewrote the rules, starting with her name on the deed. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alerts started at 3:47 a.m., not the gentle pings of routine maintenance but the sharp, insistent bleats that meant the system had found something worth panicking about. I was already awake, coffee cooling beside my workstation, running overnight stress tests on the liquidity models when the cascade began. Red flags bloomed across my monitors like digital wildfire. Counterparty exposure exceeding safe thresholds. Margin calls triggering in 17 jurisdictions simultaneously. The predictive engine I'd spent 3 years perfecting was screaming at me in algorithmic terror: massive systemic failure imminent, probability 94.7%, time to critical breach, 6 hours, 43 minutes. Most people would have called Bryce Langston immediately. Most people would have triggered the emergency protocols, woken the board, sent out the code red alerts that would have turned Tuesday morning into a media circus of damage control and blame assignment. Most people didn't understand what I understood. Panic kills more companies than problems do. Instead, I opened the manual override console I'd built into the architecture 2 years earlier, a ghost door buried so deep in the system architecture that even the security audits missed it. My fingers moved across the keyboard like a pianist playing a piece she'd rehearsed in her sleep. Reroute the margin calculations. Redistribute the risk exposure across international subsidiaries. Activate the emergency liquidity cushions I'd quietly negotiated with 3 separate jurisdictions. The bleeding stopped at 4:23 a.m. By 6:15, when Bryce finally arrived with his entourage of vice presidents and crisis managers, the system was purring like nothing had happened. The war room filled with expensive suits and nervous energy, everyone talking over each other about contingency plans and media strategies while I sat in the corner with my laptop, quietly documenting the sequence that had nearly killed us. "Where's the damage assessment?" Bryce demanded, his silver hair perfectly styled even at dawn. He had the kind of presence that made rooms reorganize themselves around him: broad shoulders, commanding voice, the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to lead. "There is no damage," I said, not looking up from my screen. The system self-corrected at 4:23. "All counterparty exposures are back within normal parameters." The room went quiet. 12 of the smartest financial minds in the city staring at me like I'd just announced the laws of physics had been temporarily suspended. Self-corrected? Bryce's voice carried that particular tone executives use when they suspect they're being made to look stupid. "Rhea, these were systemic cascading failures. Systems don't just self-correct from this level of exposure." I finally looked up. "This one does." What I didn't say, I built it to. What I didn't say, the override protocols I'd embedded 3 layers deep in the core architecture had been running silent diagnostics for months, learning the patterns, preparing for exactly this scenario. What I didn't say, while they'd been sleeping, I'd prevented a liquidity crisis that would have bankrupted us before breakfast. Arjun Patel caught my eye from across the room, the only person there who understood the depth of what had just happened. He'd been on my team long enough to recognize the signature of my coding style, the way I built systems that thought 3 moves ahead. His slight nod told me he'd been monitoring the overnight logs, had seen the ghost processes activate and resolve. But Bryce was already spinning the narrative. "Excellent work, everyone. This demonstrates the robustness of our institutional risk frameworks. I'll draft a statement for the press emphasizing Argonne's sophisticated algorithmic safeguards." Everyone nodded and smiled and began discussing the talking points that would turn near catastrophe into proof of our superior technology. I watched Bryce transform a crisis I'd solved into evidence of leadership he'd never provided, and something cold settled in my chest. "What about the post-incident analysis?" I asked. "Elena will handle that," Bryce said, not even looking at me. Fresh eyes on the situation. Elena Voss. The new hire with the Stanford MBA and the viral TED Talk about disruptive fintech paradigms. She'd been at Argonne for 6 weeks and still asked where the bathroom was. I closed my laptop and walked out while they were still congratulating themselves. In the elevator, I checked the system logs one more time. Clean. Stable. Running perfectly. On the architecture I'd built to save them from themselves. My name appeared nowhere in the incident reports. The knock came at 4:20 p.m. on a Thursday. Not the gentle tap of a colleague but the sharp, official rap that means your world is about to tilt sideways. Rhea? Could you step into conference room B? I'd been debugging a licensing protocol error, 3 monitors deep in. Code that felt like solving a puzzle someone else had deliberately scrambled. The kind of problem that usually excited me, layers of logic wrapped around themselves, waiting for the right mind to untangle them. Conference room B was the glass box at the end of the hall, the one we used for investor calls and disciplinary meetings. I'd never been summoned there before. The setup was surgical in its efficiency, Bryce at the head of the table in his navy suit, hands folded like he was about to deliver a sermon. Miranda from HR in the corner with her leather portfolio and carefully neutral expression. An empty chair across from them with a manila folder placed precisely in front of it. Please, sit, Bryce said. I sat. The folder contained a single document with the Argonne letterhead and my name typed at the top. Employment termination agreement. Effective immediately. I'm sure this comes as a surprise, Bryce continued, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. But as we've discussed in leadership meetings, Argonne is entering a new phase of growth. We need to streamline our technical architecture, bring in fresh perspectives that align with our forward-looking vision. Fresh perspectives. The phrase hit me like a slap. I'd built the technical architecture. Every line of critical code, every safeguard that kept us operational, every protocol that had prevented the disasters they didn't even know we'd avoided. I don't understand, I said, though part of me was beginning to. Elena will be taking over your portfolio, Miranda said, consulting her notes. She brings a comprehensive understanding of modern fintech frameworks and agile development methodologies. Elena. The woman who'd asked me last week how to reset her password. Your contributions to Argonne have been invaluable, Bryce continued. That's why we're offering a generous severance package, including extended healthcare and a comprehensive non-compete agreement. Invaluable. Past tense. I stared at the document in front of me. 12 pages of legal language that essentially boiled down to, take the money, sign the silence agreement, disappear quietly. My signature line waited at the bottom like a grave I was expected to dig for myself. There's a mistake, I said. The licensing protocols. The international compliance frameworks. The predictive algorithms. You can't just transfer that work. It's integrated into everything. Elena will have access to all necessary documentation, Bryce said. Plus, we're bringing in external consultants to ensure a smooth transition. External consultants. Translation, expensive contractors who would spend months trying to reverse engineer work I could explain in an afternoon. If I were allowed to explain it. This is about the override incident, isn't it? I asked. You're uncomfortable that the system prevented the crisis without board approval. Something flickered across Bryce's face, not guilt, exactly, but a calculation that told me I'd guessed correctly. This is about organizational efficiency, he said. Nothing personal, Rhea. Simply strategic realignment. Nothing personal. I'd prevented a $900 million bankruptcy 3 weeks earlier, and now I was being erased from the company I'd helped save. If that wasn't personal, I didn't understand what personal meant. Miranda slid a box across the table. Cardboard, unmarked, the kind they use for files and personal effects. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. All company equipment should remain at your workstation. I signed the document. Not because I agreed with it, but because the alternative was a legal battle I couldn't afford against a company with unlimited resources and my own architecture working against me. The elevator ride down felt like falling in slow motion. 26 floors of watching the numbers decrease while I held a box containing 6 years of my professional life, a coffee mug, a photo of my MIT graduation, the notebook where I'd sketched out the original crisis prediction algorithms during a sleepless weekend in 2019. Outside, the autumn air felt sharp against my skin. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the Argonne building, watching the windows glow with the warm light of people who still belonged there, and realized something that should have terrified me but instead felt oddly liberating. They'd taken my job, my title, my desk. But they hadn't taken the one thing that mattered most. They didn't understand what I'd actually built. My apartment in Tribeca felt like a tomb after 18 months of 12-hour days. The minimalist furniture, the untouched kitchen, the floor-to-ceiling Windows that offered a view I never had time to appreciate. All of it suddenly seemed like evidence of a life I'd forgotten to live while building someone else's empire. I set the box on my dining table and opened my laptop. Not the company-issued MacBook they'd taken from me, but my personal machine, the one where I kept the projects that mattered, the experiments that weren't ready for corporate oversight. The backup systems I'd built out of paranoia and the engineer's fundamental distrust of single points of failure. The external drive hummed to life. 3 terabytes of data I'd been syncing quietly for 2 years, updated every night at 2:15 a.m. when the Argonne network traffic was at its lowest. Not corporate espionage, everything here was code I'd written, algorithms I'd designed, documentation I'd created. My intellectual property, archived on my own time, stored on my own hardware. I pulled up the crisis prevention logs from 3 weeks earlier. The timestamp told the real story, 3:47 a.m., first alert triggered. 4:23 a.m., crisis resolved. Total elapsed time, 36 minutes of automated responses executing protocols I'd embedded 18 months earlier. Clause 8. 3b of the International Licensing Compact, buried in subsection 12 of the Technical Requirements. Critical system modifications require dual authorization from both institutional leadership and the primary architectural signatory. A bureaucratic phrase that meant nothing to lawyers and everything to anyone who understood how the code actually worked. I was the primary architectural signatory. Had been since 2019, when I'd flown to Geneva to consult on the international compliance framework. The clause had been my insurance policy, a way to ensure that changes to the core system couldn't be made without oversight from someone who understood the technical implications. They'd fired the employee, but the architecture still recognized me as the authorized guardian. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I recognized, Arjun, using his personal device. Coffee tomorrow? I have something you should see. I smiled for the first time in 3 weeks. The next morning, Arjun arrived at the cafe near my apartment with a messenger bag and the careful expression of someone who'd spent all night making a decision he couldn't unmake. We ordered coffee and found a table in the back corner, away from the startup founders and freelance consultants who treated this place like their office. They're calling it a seamless transition, he said, pulling out his laptop. Elena's been asking good questions, but she's trying to understand in 6 weeks what took you 3 years to build. He showed me the error logs from the past few days. Small things, mostly, licensing delays, false positives in the risk assessment protocols, integration failures that wouldn't make headlines but would accumulate like digital scar tissue until the system became unreliable. She asked me to walk her through the crisis prevention protocols, Arjun continued. But when I pulled up the schema, half of it was redacted. Classified above her clearance level. I nearly choked on my coffee. What do you mean, redacted? Automated security protocols. Anything touching the international compliance frameworks requires architectural-level authorization to access. Elena has administrative privileges, but not architectural. The distinction was subtle but crucial. Administrative access let you run the system, modify surface-level parameters, generate reports. Architectural access let you see how the system actually worked, understand the decision trees that governed critical functions, modify the core logic that kept everything stable. I designed it that way deliberately. Too many companies had been brought down by junior developers making changes they didn't understand, breaking systems in ways that wouldn't become apparent until catastrophic failure was inevitable. What about Bryce? I asked. He never had architectural access. Never needed it. Arjun paused, studying my face. Did you know this would happen when you set up the clearance levels? I thought about it. Had I known, consciously, that I was building a system that would remain loyal to its creator even after its creator was exiled? Or had I simply followed good security practices, the kind of defensive programming that treats every user as potentially hostile? I built it to be secure, I said finally. I didn't anticipate needing it to be protective. Arjun nodded and pulled out a USB drive. I made a complete backup of the development environment. Not just the code, the entire schema. Including the stuff that's locked behind architectural privileges. If you ever wanted to, I don't know, build something new. I took the drive. It was warm from his laptop, small enough to fit in my palm. 6 years of work reduced to 50 grams of metal and silicon. Thank you, I said. They made a mistake. Letting you go, he said. The system knows it. Elena knows it. Hell, I think even Bryce knows it, deep down. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the backup drive connected to my laptop, scrolling through directories that felt like walking through a house I'd built and furnished with my own hands. Every function was familiar, every variable name a memory, every comment a note from my past self to my future self. But now I was looking at it differently. Not as an employee maintaining a corporate asset, but as an architect studying the blueprints of a structure that had been designed to outlast its builders. They'd taken my access credentials, my corporate email, my keycard to the building. But the system itself, the deep architecture that made Argonne metrics possible, still recognized my signature, still waited for my authorization, still treated me as the primary guardian of its critical functions. I opened a new terminal window and began to code. Elena Voss had been Argonne Metrics Rising Star for exactly 18 days when she discovered that being a rising star and understanding rising star were two very different things. She sat in what used to be my office, they'd moved her into the corner workspace with the view of the Hudson, the one that was supposed to signal executive trajectory, staring at code that looked like it had been written in a foreign language. Not literally foreign. The syntax was Python, clean and readable. But the logic was dense, interconnected, recursive in ways that made her head spin. Every function called three others. Every module depended on frameworks she'd never heard of. Comments were sparse and cryptic, see Geneva Compliance Docs Section 7. 3-inch or Risk Cascade Mitigation, RHS method. She'd been hired to modernize the technical infrastructure, bring it in line with contemporary fintech practices. Agile development, microservices architecture, cloud-native solutions. The kind of buzzwords that looked impressive in PowerPoint presentations and funding decks. But the existing system wasn't built with buzzwords. It was built like a fortress, every component reinforcing every other component, designed by someone who had anticipated every possible failure mode and built safeguards against failures that hadn't even been imagined yet. Arjun? Elena called across the open office space. Could you walk me through the licensing protocol one more time? Arjun Patel looked up from his workstation. 3 monitors, coffee cup rings staining his desk, the kind of organized chaos. That came from someone who spent more time thinking than organizing. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of developer who built things that lasted. Which part specifically? He asked. All of it. How does the system decide when to approve a cross-border license transfer? Arjun wheeled his chair over to her desk, and Elena noticed the slight hesitation before he answered. The pause of someone choosing his words carefully. It's complicated, he said. The decision tree pulls data from 17 different sources. Market volatility, regulatory compliance, counterparty risk assessment, geopolitical stability indices. Then it runs everything through the predictive model to estimate the probability of successful completion. Okay, but where's the actual logic? I can see the function calls, but I can't access the underlying algorithms. Another pause. Those are locked behind architectural privileges. I have administrative access. Full system privileges. Not architectural. Elena stared at him. What's the difference? Administrative lets you run the system. Architectural lets you understand it. Who has architectural access? Arjun's expression went carefully neutral. Originally? Rhea. She designed the privilege system. But she's gone. The system doesn't know that. Elena spent the next hour trying to understand what that meant. She pulled up user access logs. System authorization records, security clearance databases. Every query returned the same result, Rhea Saito, primary architectural signatory, access level, unlimited. She tried to modify the access levels. The system politely informed her that architectural privilege changes required dual authorization. From institutional leadership and the primary architectural signatory. She was trapped in a recursive loop of permission. She couldn't understand the system without architectural access. She couldn't grant herself architectural access without already having it. And the person who could grant it had been fired 3 weeks earlier. Elena walked to Bryce's office and knocked on the door frame. He was on a call, pacing behind his desk with a Bluetooth headset and the animated gestures of someone trying to convince investors that everything was under control. I'll call you back, he said, ending the call. Elena. How's the transition going? There's a problem with the system architecture. I can't access the core algorithms. What do you mean, can't access? They're locked behind security clearances. That only Rhea had. I need her authorization to understand how the system actually works. Bryce's jaw tightened. That's ridiculous. You have full administrative privileges. Not architectural. What's the difference? Elena repeated Arjun's explanation, watching Bryce's expression shift from confusion to irritation to something that looked like fear. Get our legal team on this immediately, he said. There has to be a way to override the security protocols. I tried. The system says architectural changes require dual authorization. Institutional leadership plus primary architectural signatory. I'm institutional leadership. But Rhea's still listed as the primary signatory. The system won't accept changes without her approval. Bryce sat down heavily in his chair. For a moment, Elena saw past the executive presence to something more vulnerable underneath, a man who had just realized he didn't actually control the company he was supposed to be running. This was intentional, he said quietly. She built this as a trap. Elena wasn't sure that was true. The security architecture seemed designed for protection, not sabotage. Good engineering practices taken to their logical conclusion. But she could see how someone like Bryce would interpret it as betrayal. What do you want me to do? She asked. Fix it. Hire outside consultants if you have to. But I want full access to that system within the week. Elena spent the rest of the afternoon on calls with security firms and system integration specialists. Every conversation followed the same pattern: initial confidence, followed by questions about documentation, followed by requests for architectural schematics, followed by uncomfortable silences when she explained that the schematics were locked behind the security system they were trying to bypass. You're describing a digital fortress, one consultant told her. Technically sophisticated, legally bulletproof. Whoever designed this really didn't want anyone else understanding how it worked. That evening, Elena stayed late in the office. Alone with the humming servers and the gentle glow of monitors displaying data she could see but not interpret. She tried running diagnostic routines, stress tests, anything that might give her insight into the system's decision-making processes. At 11:47 p.m., her phone buzzed with a notification. System alert, unauthorized access attempt detected. Architectural security protocols engaged. Primary signatory notification sent. Elena stared at the message. Somewhere in the city, Rhea Saito's phone had just received an alert that someone was trying to probe the depths of the system she'd built. The ghost in the machine, still watching, still protective of the architecture she'd created. Elena closed her laptop and went home. For the first time since taking the job, she wondered if she was trying to replace someone irreplaceable, and whether the system itself was trying to tell her that some things weren't meant to be transferred. The decision came to me at 3:33 a.m. On a Tuesday, sitting in my apartment with Elena's unauthorized access attempt still glowing on my phone screen. For 3 weeks, I'd been watching from the outside as they tried to understand what I'd built, tried to replace what couldn't be replaced, tried to erase what had been designed to be indelible. But watching wasn't enough anymore. I opened my laptop and navigated to a directory I'd created 2 years earlier but never used. A folder labeled Emergency Protocols, buried 6 levels deep in my backup drive, containing code I'd written during a particularly paranoid weekend when I'd wondered what would happen if Argon ever tried to lock me out of the system I'd built to protect them. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The file was called digital_conscience. PY, a name that had seemed melodramatic when I'd written it but felt precise now. Conscience, the inner voice that tells you when something is wrong and compels you to act. I'd built a digital version, embedded deep in the licensing architecture, dormant until activated by a very specific sequence of events. Unauthorized modification attempts. Administrative override failures. And most importantly, the removal of the primary architectural signatory from active status without proper system handover protocols. All 3 conditions had been met. I opened the activation script and stared at the code for 20 minutes. Once I ran this, there would be no going back. The system would lock down all international licensing until proper authorization was re-established. Not a crash, not a failure, just a quiet, inexorable refusal to process any transactions that required the architectural level decisions they couldn't make without me. My finger hovered over the enter key. This wasn't sabotage, I told myself. This was systems integrity. The digital equivalent of a safety valve, designed to prevent catastrophic failures when unqualified users tried to modify critical infrastructure. I pressed enter. The script ran silently, no dramatic alerts or warning messages. Just a few lines of text scrolling past, authentication protocols updated. International licensing queue paused. Architectural review required for continued operation. Estimated time to critical failure, 72 hours. 72 hours. Long enough for them to notice the problem, understand its scope, and realize they needed me. Short enough that permanent damage could be avoided if they made the right choices. I closed the laptop and went back to bed. For the first time in 3 weeks, I slept soundly. The first signs appeared on Wednesday morning. Elena would later tell me she noticed it as a slight delay in the licensing approval queue. Transactions that usually processed in minutes were taking hours. Nothing alarming at first, just a subtle drag on the system's responsiveness that could be explained by network congestion or server load. By Wednesday afternoon, the delays had become failures. Licensing requests from the London office, the Singapore subsidiary, the Geneva compliance team, all of them sitting in pending status with cryptic error messages. Architectural review required. Primary signatory authorization needed. Elena called an emergency meeting. Arjun, the compliance team, the senior developers, even the IT security contractor they'd hired to bypass my access controls. 12 people crowded into conference room B, staring at laptops displaying the same message. Over and over, authorization required. Authorization required. Authorization required. What does this mean? Bryce demanded, pacing behind his chair like a caged animal. Authorization from who? The primary architectural signatory, Elena said quietly. Rhea. That's impossible. She doesn't work here anymore. She doesn't have access to our systems. She doesn't need access, Arjun said. This is a lockdown protocol. The system is refusing to process critical transactions until architectural integrity is restored. Can we override it? We tried. The override requires the same authorization that's being withheld. Bryce turned to the security contractor, a thin man with expensive glasses who'd been typing furiously on his laptop for the past hour. What about you? Can you break through this? The contractor looked up with the expression of someone who'd just encountered a puzzle designed by a mind more clever than his own. This isn't a hack, he said. This is the system working exactly as designed. The lockdown protocols are built into the foundational architecture. Trying to bypass them would be like trying to remove the foundation of a building while people are still living in it. So we're hostage to a disgruntled ex-employee? You're hostage to the person who built the system you depend on, the contractor corrected. And who, according to the documentation, tried to warn you about exactly this scenario when she designed the security protocols. Elena had been quiet through most of the meeting, but now she spoke up. There's something else. I've been monitoring the transaction volume. We process about $200 million in international licensing per day. If this lockdown continues, we'll start defaulting on obligations by Friday. The room went silent. $200 million a day. In 72 hours, they would be facing the kind of liquidity crisis that destroyed companies overnight. The same kind of crisis I'd prevented 3 weeks earlier, before they decided I was expendable. Call her, Bryce said finally. Sir? Call Rhea. Bring her in for a consultation. Whatever she wants, pay it. Elena nodded and pulled out her phone. I knew she would call because I'd been monitoring the system logs remotely, watching the lockdown cascade through their operations like a slow-motion avalanche. When my phone rang at 4:47 p.m., I let it go to voicemail. The message was exactly what I'd expected, professional, apologetic, desperate. Rhea, this is Elena Voss. We're experiencing some technical difficulties with the licensing system and could really use your expertise. Could you call me back at your earliest convenience? We're prepared to discuss compensation for your time. I saved the voicemail but didn't return the call. Not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and checked the countdown timer I'd embedded in the lockdown script. 57 hours, 32 minutes remaining. Enough time for them to truly understand what they'd lost. Enough time for the panic to set in, for the finger-pointing to begin, for Bryce to realize that firing the architect of his company's most critical system had been a catastrophic miscalculation. I ordered Chinese takeout and settled in to watch the digital siege I'd designed unfold exactly as planned. Thursday morning brought the headlines I'd been waiting for. Not front-page news, financial system glitches rarely captured public imagination unless they involved consumer banking or cryptocurrency crashes. But buried in the financial sections of the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times, small stories that would grow larger as the day progressed. Argonne Metrics faces licensing delays amid technical issues, fintech giants' international operations disrupted by system failures. Sources, $600 million in transactions stalled at regulatory technology firm. I read them over coffee in my apartment, watching the sunrise paint the Hudson River gold while Argonne Metrics slowly hemorrhaged money 40 blocks south. The articles were cautiously worded, full of corporate spokesperson quotes about temporary technical challenges and working around the clock to restore full functionality. But between the lines, I could read the panic. My phone had been ringing every 30 minutes since 6 a.m. Elena, Bryce, numbers I didn't recognize that were probably board members or lawyers or crisis management consultants. I let them all go to voicemail, accumulating a digital record of escalating desperation. The 8th call came from Lena Dwyer. I answered. Rhea. Her voice was careful, professional, but I could hear the strain underneath. I think we need to talk. Lena was compliance, the former SEC auditor who joined Argonne to build internal integrity systems. Unlike the executives and engineers, she understood the regulatory implications of what was happening. She knew that a licensing system failure wasn't just a technical problem, it was a legal crisis that could cascade into regulatory sanctions, audit findings, and the kind of compliance nightmares that destroyed companies from the inside. What do you want to talk about? I asked. You know what? The lockdown protocol. The authorization requirements. The fact that every international transaction we've attempted in the past 36 hours has failed with your digital signature requirements. I haven't accessed your system since I was terminated. I know. That's what makes this so elegant. You don't need to access the system to control it. You built the control into the architecture itself. There was a long pause. Lena was smart enough to understand what she was looking at, and honest enough to call it what it was. They made a mistake, she said finally. They made several mistakes. Bryce wants to bring you back. Consultant basis, whatever rate you want, full architectural access restored. To fix the problem I created? To fix the problem they created when they fired the only person who understood how the system worked. I considered this. Bringing me back as a consultant would solve their immediate crisis, but it wouldn't address the underlying issue. They demonstrated that they saw me as replaceable, expendable, a resource to be discarded when convenient and recalled when necessary. Going back on their terms would validate that perspective. I'll think about it, I said, and hung up. But I already knew what my answer would be. 20 minutes later, Elena called again. This time I answered. Rhea, thank God. We really need your help. The licensing system is completely locked down, and we can't figure out how to restore functionality. I know. You know? I built the lockdown protocol. It's working exactly as designed. Silence. Then, you did this intentionally? I built a system that protects itself from unqualified modifications. What you're experiencing isn't a malfunction, it's a feature. But we need to process transactions. We have clients depending on us, regulatory deadlines to meet. Then you should have thought about that before firing the person who designed your regulatory compliance system. Elena's voice took on a pleading tone. Look, I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But innocent people are going to get hurt if this continues. Our clients, their patients, the healthcare systems that depend on our licensing protocols. That gave me pause. I'd been thinking about this as a conflict between me and Argonne's leadership, but Elena was right about the collateral damage. The licensing system we'd built facilitated medical AI deployments across 17 countries. Delays in processing could mean delayed diagnoses, postponed treatments, real harm to real people. But that wasn't my responsibility anymore. They'd made that clear when they escorted me out of the building. You have 48 hours, I said. 48 hours for what? To figure out how to restore architectural authorization. After that, the lockdown becomes permanent. Rhea, please. Be reasonable. I am being reasonable. I built safeguards to prevent exactly this scenario, unqualified personnel making changes to critical infrastructure. You triggered those safeguards when you tried to replace me with someone who doesn't understand the system. Now you're experiencing the consequences. What do you want? Money? Stock options? A formal apology? What did I want? For 3 weeks, I'd been asking myself that question. At first, I'd wanted my job back, wanted recognition for the work I'd done, wanted them to acknowledge their mistake. But sitting in my apartment, watching their empire slowly crumble under the weight of its own arrogance, I realized I wanted something bigger. I wanted to build something better. I want to buy the company, I said. Elena laughed, a sharp sound that held no humor. Buy the company? Rhea, Argonne is worth $800 million. Not anymore. Check your stock price. I could hear typing on the other end of the line. Then a sharp intake of breath. It's down 40% since yesterday. And falling. By the time the lockdown becomes permanent, your market cap will be a fraction of what it was last week. At that point, someone with the right expertise and adequate funding could acquire a controlling stake for a very reasonable price. You're talking about hostile takeover. I'm talking about a rescue operation. The question is whether you want to be rescued by someone who understands what you've built, or someone who'll strip it for parts. The line went quiet. In the background, I could hear the sounds of crisis management, muffled voices, ringing phones, the controlled chaos of a company in freefall. 48 hours, I repeated, and hung up. I spent the rest of Thursday making phone calls of my own. Not to lawyers or board members, but to the one person who might have the resources and vision to help me turn this crisis into an opportunity. Darius Vong answered on the third ring. Rhea Saito. I was wondering when you'd call. Darius Vong's office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower in Midtown, all clean lines and strategic emptiness. The kind of space designed to make visitors feel small while the occupant remained perfectly comfortable. When I arrived at 2 p.m. Friday, exactly 24 hours before my lockdown protocol would become irreversible, he was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows with his back to the door. "Rhea Saito," he said without turning around. "The woman who's currently holding an $800 million company hostage with elegant code." I'd researched Darius extensively before making the call. 47 years old, MIT dropout turned serial acquirer, owned controlling stakes in 6 financial technology firms across 3 continents. The kind of investor who bought distressed companies, stripped them down to their valuable components, and rebuilt them as lean profit machines. He had a reputation for cold calculation and perfect timing. "I prefer to think of it as systems integrity," I said. He turned around, and I saw the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Expensive suit, silver hair, the confident posture of someone who'd never doubted his right to own whatever he wanted. "Please, sit. I've been following your situation with considerable interest." The conference table was glass and steel, designed to intimidate. 2 chairs facing each other across an expanse that felt like a negotiation battlefield. I sat and pulled out my laptop. "Before we discuss terms," I said, "I want to show you what you'd actually be buying." For the next hour, I walked Darius through the architecture I'd built at Argon Metrics. Not the marketing version they sold to investors, but the real thing, the predictive algorithms that prevented crises before they happened, the compliance frameworks that navigated international regulatory requirements automatically, the risk assessment engines that processed thousands of variables in real time to make decisions human analysts couldn't match. "This is impressive," Darius said, leaning back in his chair. "But it's also entirely dependent on you. What happens if you get hit by a bus tomorrow?" That's why I built comprehensive documentation and training protocols. The system can be operated by qualified personnel, but it requires deep understanding of the underlying logic. The kind of understanding that comes from years of working with the architecture, not 6 weeks of trying to reverse engineer it. "Like your friend Arjun?" I wasn't surprised he knew about Arjun. Darius hadn't built his empire by making uninformed decisions. Arjun understands the technical implementation. But the strategic vision, the architectural philosophy, the ability to see 3 moves ahead, that's harder to transfer. Which brings us to the central question: what exactly are you proposing? I pulled up a document I'd spent 3 sleepless nights perfecting. I rebuilt the system from scratch. Cleaner code, better documentation, more modular architecture. But this time, I own it. My name on the patents, my signature on the compliance frameworks, my company providing the technology that Argon's clients actually need. And Argon itself becomes a customer. They can license the technology, pay for support and maintenance, operate under our framework. But they don't own the intellectual property anymore. Darius studied the proposal with the intensity of someone who'd made his fortune by seeing value others missed. "This is essentially a white label solution. You build the engine, they provide the brand and customer relationships." "Exactly. Except the engine is what actually matters. Everything else is just marketing." "What do you need from me?" $50 million in acquisition capital. Argon stock is in free fall. By Monday, their market cap will be low enough that 50 million buys controlling interest. Plus another 20 million for development costs, team acquisition, and operational expenses. 70 million total. What's my return? Complete ownership of the most sophisticated financial risk assessment platform in the market. Current annual revenue from licensing, 200 million. Projected growth with proper management, 300% over 5 years. Darius was quiet for a long moment, running calculations I couldn't see. "There's significant regulatory risk. If the SEC decides this was market manipulation, it wasn't manipulation. It was system design. I built safeguards to prevent unauthorized modifications, and those safeguards were triggered when unqualified personnel attempted to override my authority. Everything I did was technically legal and professionally ethical." Technically legal isn't the same as politically safe. Which is why we do this right. Full transparency, complete compliance documentation, everything above board. We're not destroying Argon, we're saving it from its own incompetence. Darius stood and walked back to the windows. Below us, Manhattan spread out like a circuit board, millions of people going about their business while we discussed reshaping the infrastructure they depended on. "I'll need to see the technical specifications," he said finally. "Complete architecture review, security audit, scalability assessment. If the technology is as sophisticated as you claim, we have a deal. And if it's not? Then you're a very expensive consultant who's about to fix Argon's problems and disappear." I closed my laptop and stood. You'll have the specifications by tomorrow morning. But I need your commitment now. Argon's board is meeting Sunday to discuss emergency options. If we're going to do this, we need to move fast. Darius turned from the window and extended his hand. Welcome to Vongtech Acquisitions, Ms. Saito. Let's go buy ourselves a company. That evening, I sat in my apartment drafting the technical documentation Darius had requested, but my mind kept drifting to a conversation I'd had with my MIT advisor 7 years earlier. Professor Chen had been reviewing my graduate thesis. An early version of the predictive algorithms that would eventually become Argon's core technology. This is brilliant work, Rhea, he'd said. But be careful. When you build something this powerful, you become indispensable. And indispensable people make others nervous. At the time, I'd thought he was being overly cautious. I wanted to be indispensable. I wanted to build systems so elegant and essential that no one would ever question their value. Now I understood what he'd been trying to tell me. Indispensable people don't get promoted, they get eliminated. The moment your value becomes threatening to those in power, your expertise becomes a liability. But there was another way to be indispensable. Not as an employee, but as an owner. Not as someone who could be fired, but as someone who controlled the very foundation of the business. I finished the documentation at 3:47 a.m., the same time my crisis prevention system had saved Argon 6 weeks earlier. The symmetry felt appropriate. This time, instead of saving someone else's company in darkness and silence, I was building my own future in the quiet hours when the world slept and the only sound was the gentle clicking of keys as I wrote the code that would define everything that came next. By Monday morning, Darius would have everything he needed to make his decision. By Monday afternoon, Argon's board would be facing a choice between salvation and destruction. And by Monday evening, I would either own the company that had tried to erase me, or I would watch it collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Either way, I was done being invisible. Sunday morning brought the kind of autumn clarity that made Manhattan look like an architectural photograph, sharp lines, perfect light, the city presenting its best face while people like me remade its financial infrastructure in conference rooms 40 stories above the street. I'd been awake since 4 a.m., not from anxiety but from the peculiar alertness that comes when years of planning finally converge into action. Darius had called at 6:15. The technical review is complete. Your architecture is even more sophisticated than you claimed. We're moving forward. By 9 a.m., Vongtech's legal team had prepared the acquisition documents. By 10 a.m., Darius had secured bridge financing from 3 institutional investors who understood that distressed technology companies with valuable intellectual property were opportunities disguised as crises. By 11 a.m., we were ready to make an offer that would either save Argon Metrics or expose its leadership as completely detached from reality. The Argon board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in their executive conference room, the glass box at the top of their Tribeca tower where 12 very expensive people would decide whether to accept rescue or choose pride. I wouldn't be there, of course. Former employees weren't invited to board meetings, even when they held all the cards. But Lena Dwyer would be there. 3 days earlier, she'd made a choice that surprised even me. Instead of staying quietly compliant, while her company hemorrhaged money and credibility, she'd started documenting everything. The technical failures that preceded my termination. The security violations involved in attempting to bypass my architectural safeguards. The regulatory implications of operating critical financial infrastructure without proper technical oversight. She'd sent me the documents Friday night with a simple message: someone needs to tell the truth. The truth was uglier than I'd realized. Not just the ham-handed attempt to replace me with Elena, but months of systematic efforts to minimize my role, strip my name from patent filings, and present my work as collaborative team achievements rather than individual innovations. They hadn't just fired me, they'd been erasing me for months, preparing for a future where Rhea Saito was a footnote in someone else's success story. Now that footnote was about to become the headline. At 2:15 p.m., my phone rang. Elena, calling from the conference room where my professional fate had been decided 5 weeks earlier. Rhea, they want to talk. I'm listening. Can you lift the lockdown? Bryce is willing to discuss reinstatement, full restoration of your position, even a seat on the technical advisory board. I walked to my window and looked south toward the Argonne building. From this distance, it looked like any other glass tower, indistinguishable from the dozens of others that housed the firms and funds and startups that thought they controlled the flow of global capital. It's too late for reinstatement, I said. What do you mean? Check your email. Vongtech Acquisitions just made a formal offer to purchase Argon Metrics. $50 million for 51% equity, with an additional $20 million allocated for operational restructuring. Silence. Then muffled voices, the sound of Elena relaying information to people who were probably staring at their phones, refreshing their email, trying to understand how they'd lost control of their own company while sitting in their own boardroom. Rhea, this is insane. You can't just buy us. I'm not buying you. Darius Vong is. I'm simply providing the technical expertise that makes the acquisition valuable. But why? Why destroy everything we built together? The question hung in the air between us. Why destroy everything we built together? Except we hadn't built it together. I'd built it while they took credit. I'd prevented crises while they collected bonuses. I'd designed systems that made them indispensable while they made me expendable. I'm not destroying anything, I said. I'm buying it back. The call ended, and I sat in my apartment waiting for the second phase to begin. At 3:30, my phone buzzed with a news alert: Argonne Metrics Board rejects acquisition offer, stock continues decline. At 4:15, another alert: technical failures mount at financial tech firm as international licensing remains stalled. But the most important message came at 4:47 p.m., forwarded by Lena from her personal email account. An internal memo she'd intercepted, marked confidential, from Bryce to the senior leadership team: emergency session scheduled for 6 p.m., Vong Tech offer rejected unanimously. Legal review indicates Saito lockdown protocols may constitute intellectual property theft. Considering criminal referral to FBI Cybercrime Division. All technical staff to prepare complete documentation of system access logs for law enforcement review. I read the memo twice, then called Darius. They're going to try to have me arrested, I said. I know. My legal team is already drafting response documents. Every line of code you wrote is documented, every protocol you implemented is legally yours, every safeguard you built is covered under standard intellectual property protections. That won't stop them from making it expensive and public. Which is why we're accelerating the timeline. Emergency shareholder meeting tomorrow morning. The institutional investors are losing patience, and 3 board members have already called asking about the Vong Tech offer. What changed their minds? Reality. Stock price hit $15 this morning. 12 months ago, it was trading at 63. Shareholders want answers, and the only answer that makes sense is accepting our offer. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in weeks: I cooked dinner. Not because I was hungry, but because I needed the familiar rhythm of chopping vegetables and monitoring heat, the simple pleasure of creating something nourishing with my own hands. While pasta boiled and garlic sautéed, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Professor Chen all those years ago. When you build something powerful, you become indispensable. And indispensable people make others nervous. He'd been right about the first part. The predictive algorithms I'd designed, the crisis prevention protocols I'd implemented, the compliance frameworks I'd architected, all of it had become indispensable to Argonne's operations. So indispensable that they couldn't function without it, couldn't understand it, couldn't replace it. But he'd been wrong about the second part. I hadn't made them nervous because I was indispensable. I'd made them nervous because I was independent. Because I'd built systems that answered to technical truth rather than corporate hierarchy, that prioritized stability over politics, that couldn't be bullied or manipulated or fired. In trying to make me dispensable, they'd made themselves powerless. Tomorrow morning, in a conference room I'd never see, 12 board members would vote on whether to accept an offer that would save their company by handing control to the woman they'd tried to erase. Some would vote yes because they understood that salvation mattered more than pride. Others would vote no because admitting mistake felt worse than accepting failure. But the mathematics were clear. 51% control meant I wouldn't need their permission anymore. I wouldn't need their approval, their recognition, their grudging acknowledgement of my value. I would simply own the thing I'd built. At 11:30 p.m., as I was falling asleep, my phone buzzed with a text message from Arjun: "Whatever happens tomorrow, you should know, the system runs better when you're in control of it." I smiled and turned off the light. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or warfare, either ownership or exile. But tonight, for the first time in 6 weeks, I slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who'd stopped waiting for permission to claim what was rightfully hers. The emergency shareholder meeting convened at 9 a.m. Monday in the same conference room where they'd fired me 7 weeks earlier. I wasn't there, wouldn't be there until the votes were counted and the papers were signed, but Darius called me with updates every 30 minutes like a war correspondent filing dispatches from a battlefield I'd designed but couldn't witness. Motion to accept the Vong Tech offer passed 8-4, he told me at 11:15. Bryce and 3 allies voted against, but the institutional shareholders overruled them. We own 51% as of noon today. I was standing in my apartment kitchen, drinking coffee that had gone cold while I waited for the call that would either vindicate 6 years of work or condemn me to starting over from nothing. The Relief should have been overwhelming, but instead I felt something quieter, the satisfaction of watching logic prevail over politics, mathematics triumph over ego. What about Bryce? Resigned effective immediately. Took his allies with him. Elena's been named interim CEO until we complete the management transition. Elena. The woman they'd brought in to replace me, now tasked with managing the transition that would restore me. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. When do I get my keys back? This afternoon. Legal needs 2 hours to process the ownership transfer, then the building is yours. My building. My company. My name on the door instead of buried in code comments that nobody read. At 2:30 p.m., I walked through the lobby of the Argonne Metrics building for the first time in 7 weeks. The security guard, the same one who'd watched me leave with my cardboard box, looked confused when I approached his desk. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification." I handed him my driver's license and a letter from Bankruptcy's legal team. He read it twice, made a phone call, read it again, then handed me a new keycard with my name printed in clean black letters, Rhea Saito, Chief Executive Officer. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending through layers of my own past. Each floor we passed had been witness to late nights and breakthrough moments, to the gradual construction of systems that had become so fundamental to the company's operations that they couldn't be removed without destroying everything built on top of them. The executive suite was exactly as I remembered, glass offices overlooking the Hudson, conference rooms designed for presentations to investors who cared more about growth projections than technical elegance, the kind of space that projected authority without understanding what authority actually meant. Elena was waiting in what used to be Bryce's office, looking smaller than I remembered her. The executive chair seemed to dwarf her, and she kept fidgeting with papers that probably didn't need organizing. "Congratulations," she said as I entered. "I mean that sincerely. What you've accomplished here is remarkable." "What we're about to accomplish," I corrected. "I didn't buy this company to settle scores. I bought it to fix what was broken." We spent the next hour walking through the transition plan I'd drafted during my weeks in exile. Not a purge, most of the technical staff would stay, along with the client relationship managers and compliance specialists who understood how to operate in the regulatory environment we'd built. But the management structure needed to change, the development priorities needed to be reordered, and most importantly, the culture needed to shift from politics back to engineering excellence. "What about me?" Elena asked finally. "I know you didn't choose me for this role." "No, I didn't. But you've handled an impossible situation with more grace than I would have expected. The question is whether you want to learn how to actually do this job or whether you prefer the version where someone else builds the systems and you take credit for them." She considered this for a moment. "I want to learn. I know I was in over my head, but I also know what I saw these past few weeks. The elegance of your architecture, the way everything connects to everything else. The predictive capabilities that seem almost supernatural until you understand the logic behind them. I want to understand that logic. Then you'll head our transparency initiative. Full documentation of every system, complete architectural guides, training protocols that actually prepare people to work with complex infrastructure. If we're going to rebuild this company around technical excellence, we need to make excellence teachable." By 4 p.m., I was sitting in my new office, not Bryce's old space, but a corner workspace with 3 monitors and a view of the server room, where the actual work happened. Arjun knocked on the door frame and entered without waiting for permission, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who'd been waiting weeks to have a conversation. "So," he said, setting 1 cup in front of me. "Chief Executive Officer. How does it feel?" "Like the beginning of something harder than what came before." "Harder than rebuilding financial infrastructure while your former employer tries to have you arrested?" I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had in months. "Fair point. But running a company is different from building systems. Systems follow logical rules. People don't. Speaking of people, I have something for you." He pulled out a USB drive, not the backup he'd given me weeks earlier, but something new. Complete development environment for Saito protocols. Clean codebase, modular architecture, designed to be maintained by a team instead of dependent on a single architect. Saito protocols? Well, you can't keep calling it the Argonne system. It's your company now. Time to put your name on the things you build. I plugged in the drive and opened the directory structure he'd created. It was beautiful, logical, elegant, designed with the kind of forward-thinking architecture that would survive changes in leadership, technology, and business requirements. The work I'd done in isolation, refined and improved by someone who understood not just the technical requirements but the human ones. "There's something else," Arjun said. "Lena compiled a complete report on the compliance violations that led to your termination." Not for revenge, for prevention. She wants to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Where is she? Conference room B. With half the technical staff. They're calling it the Never Again meeting. Documenting every policy failure, every communication breakdown, every institutional bias that contributed to the crisis. They want to build safeguards into the company culture the same way you built safeguards into the technical architecture. I closed the laptop and stood. Time to join the meeting where my former colleagues were designing the future I'd fought to create. But first, there was something I needed to do. I walked to the executive bathroom, the one I'd never been allowed to use when I was just the architect of the company's success, and looked at myself in the mirror. Same face, same hands, same mind that had designed systems capable of preventing financial catastrophes. But different context now. Different authority. Not the authority that comes from being indispensable to other people's plans, but the authority that comes from owning the plans themselves. I straightened my shoulders and walked toward conference room B, where the real work of rebuilding would begin. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the Geneva International Conference Center, looking out at an audience of financial regulators, technology architects, and policymakers from 47 countries. The same conference center where I'd once sat in the back row as a junior consultant, watching senior executives present frameworks I'd designed while my name appeared only in footnote acknowledgments. Today, my name was on the keynote program, Rhea Saito, CEO, Saito Financial Technologies, Redefining Ownership in Critical Infrastructure Systems. The past half year had been a controlled demolition followed by precise reconstruction. We'd renamed the company, rebuilt the technical architecture around open standards and documented processes, and most importantly, redesigned the corporate culture around principles of technical excellence and institutional integrity. The Saito protocols had become the gold standard for predictive financial risk assessment, licensed to 17 countries and used by regulatory bodies that valued stability over politics. But the real victory wasn't technological, it was philosophical. We'd proven that complex systems could be built without sacrificing transparency, that technical leadership could coexist with ethical governance, that the people who actually understand how things work deserve to control the institutions that depend on their expertise. Elena sat in the front row, no longer the overwhelmed replacement but a competent head of transparency initiatives who'd spent 6 months learning to read the architecture she'd once tried to replace. Arjun was beside her, now CTO of a company that valued deep understanding over flashy innovation. Lena had joined our board of directors, bringing her compliance expertise to bear on building institutional safeguards that would prevent future episodes of technical talent being discarded for political convenience. Even Darius was there, sitting with the investors and acquisition specialists who'd learned that sometimes the best investment strategy was backing the people who actually built the things everyone else was trying to buy. 3 years ago, I prevented a $900 million bankruptcy using systems I designed to protect a company that would later fire me for being too essential to their operations. Today, I want to talk about what that experience taught me about ownership, authorship, and the relationship between technical expertise and institutional power. The audience was quiet, attentive. These were people who understood that financial systems were built on trust, and trust was built on competence, and competence was built on the kind of deep technical knowledge that couldn't be faked or delegated or replaced with management consulting. The traditional model treats technical expertise as a service, something you hire when needed, dismiss when convenient, and replace when expedient. But complex systems require something deeper than service. They require authorship. And authorship implies ownership. I clicked to the next slide, a diagram showing the architectural relationship between technical design and institutional control. Not the sanitized version we presented to investors, but the real thing, the way power actually flowed through organizations that depended on expertise they didn't understand. When we built Saito Financial Technologies, we started with a different principle. The people who design critical infrastructure should have meaningful control over how that infrastructure is used. Not just technical access, but ownership stakes. Not just consulting fees, but decision-making authority. Not just credit for their work, but protection from political retaliation when that work becomes inconvenient. The questions that followed were predictable: concerns about concentrated technical power, worries about institutional stability, the usual anxieties that arose whenever established hierarchies were challenged by competence-based alternatives. I answered each one with the patient precision I'd learned from years of explaining complex systems to people who needed to understand the conclusions without necessarily following the reasoning. But the question that mattered came from a young woman in the third row, someone who looked like I had 5 years earlier, brilliant, ambitious, probably working 18-hour days building systems for people who would take credit for her innovations. Miss Saito, what advice would you give to technical professionals who find themselves in positions similar to your former situation? How do you protect yourself from institutional betrayal? I thought about this for a moment. The diplomatic answer would focus on documentation, on building relationships, on the importance of communication and stakeholder management. All true, but not sufficient. Build systems that outlast the people who commission them, I said finally. Document everything, not just for operational continuity but for attribution. Design safeguards that protect the work itself, not just the organization that benefits from it. And most importantly, never build anything so sophisticated that only you can understand it unless you're prepared to own it yourself. The applause was polite but sustained. When it ended, I delivered the closing line I'd been crafting for months. You can fire the architect, but the building remembers who designed it. You can erase the name from the organizational chart, but the code remembers who wrote it. And when systems fail because the people who understood them have been discarded for political convenience, the market remembers who actually knew how to fix them. After the conference, I walked along Lake Geneva in the early evening light, thinking about the trajectory that had brought me from fired employee to industry keynote in less than a year. Not revenge, I'd never been interested in destroying Bryce or humiliating the board members who'd voted to eliminate me. The best revenge against people who treated expertise as expendable was proving that expertise was actually irreplaceable. My phone buzzed with a message from Professor Chen, my old MIT advisor who'd warned me years earlier about the dangers of becoming indispensable. He'd watched the keynote online and sent a single line of text: "You found a way to be indispensable to yourself instead of to others. Proud of you." That evening, I sat in my hotel room overlooking the lake, working on the next phase of Saito Financial Technologies. Not just a company, but a model, a demonstration that technical excellence and institutional integrity could coexist, that the people who actually built the systems everyone depended on deserved to control those systems. The financial press would call it a successful corporate turnaround. The technology journals would focus on our architectural innovations. The business schools would write case studies about leveraged acquisitions and strategic market timing. But the real story was simpler and more profound. Sometimes the person who gets fired for being too good at their job is exactly the person who should have been running the company all along. I closed my laptop and looked out at the lake, where the lights of Geneva reflected on water that had witnessed centuries of negotiations between people who understood power and people who merely possessed it. Tomorrow I would fly back to New York, back to the company that bore my name and operated according to principles I'd learned by watching what happened when expertise was treated as dispensable. The lockdown protocol that had started this entire sequence was still embedded in our new architecture, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. A digital monument to the proposition that systems built with integrity should protect themselves from being corrupted by politics, that good work should survive the departure of good people, and that sometimes the best way to fix a broken institution is to buy it and rebuild it according to your own specifications. You can fire the name, but not the code it wrote. And when the code is sophisticated enough, eventually it writes back. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.